So our first question is, why did Andrew Jackson fight the national bank, and what happened to the American banking system as a result? So at this time, no bank had more power than the Bank of the United States. It had gotten to the point where the national bank had so much power that it was almost like another branch of government. The bank was due for its charter renewal in 1836, but Henry Clay, Andrew Jackson's opposition in the presidential race of 1832, pushed for the recharter bill to pass through Congress 4 years earlier than scheduled. Clay wanted the bank to become one of the issues in the 1832 election, thus inciting the Bank War of 1832. Clay assumed that if Jackson stuck with his and his followers' beliefs and vetoed the bill, he would be alienating the influential, wealthy groups in the East. But if Jackson succumbed to Congress and allowed the recharter bill to pass, he would be alienating his own followers. The basic idea was that whatever action Jackson took in regard to the rechartering of the national bank, he would be estranging some group of people, therefore losing votes in the upcoming election. What Clay failed to realize was that the group of wealthy Easterners was becoming smaller and less prominent, and that the common man was in fact becoming more and more influential in government. The recharter bill slid through Congress, and Jackson retaliated with a scorching veto, declaring the bank unconstitutional, even though the 1819 court case McCulloch v. Maryland asserted that the national bank was indeed constitutional. Jackson felt that the Bank of the United States held too much power without accountability, and that was one of the reasons that made it ultimately unconstitutional in his opinion. For example, the national bank had a stable and metallic, meaning out of gold and silver coins, currency, while smaller banks, known as wildcat banks, which common people had access to, handed out flimsy paper notes that fluctuated in value. The national bank didn't print a national paper currency, or any currency really, that common folk had access to, so each of the wildcat banks printed their own, and as a result, the value of the assorted paper notes was always fluctuating. So basically, after being vetoed, the bank was set to expire in 1836, but of course, Andrew Jackson couldn't let it die in peace. He wanted to destroy it. So in 1833, acting against the advice of his cabinet members, Jackson announced that funds would no longer be deposited into the Bank of the United States. Instead, he began putting them in various state banks or pet banks. This way, he would be bleeding the national bank dry until it didn't exist anymore. Okay, so the president of the Bank of the United States was, at this time, a man named Nicholas Biddle, who he wielded enormous amounts of power over the nation's finances. He anticipated Jackson's actions against the bank, so he created something called Biddle's Panic. Basically, he just wanted to create a minor financial crisis to show how important the bank really was to America. Though it drove many smaller, less stable banks into the wall, Jackson's resolution remained firm. If anything, Biddle's vengeful, desperate acts seemed to justify the earlier accusations of the bank's adversaries. So in the end, Jackson won the bank war, but in 1836, Jackson realized the unreliability of wildcat bank currency. So he authorized the Treasury to create the specie circular. A specie was a piece of gold or silver. Along with this new currency was a decree that required that all public lands had to be purchased with this money. This drastic step completely changed the direction of American finances and also contributed greatly to the financial panic and crash in 1837.
The National Bank was good and bad for Americans. We'll start with the bad. The Bank of the U.S. was a bank mostly for federal funds and private businesses. The currency of the National Bank was stable and metallic, meaning that it only used gold and silver coins. But the common American did not have access to the National Bank and its stable currency. Instead, they used volatile paper notes printed by wildcat banks. So the bank increased the disparity between the wealthy and the poor in America, since the more influential aristocratic families owned businesses that were invested in the bank and had access to stable currency, while the poorer farmers and laborers were subject to a currency that caused them to lose money due to frequent fluctuation. The National Bank was also anti-Western. On top of the volatile paper of wildcat banks stunting Western expansion, the National Bank foreclosed Western farms and had to pay foreign investors and domestic investors in New England and the East. Basically, the East was profiting off the West, hardships of the West. Because it was a private institution, it wasn't accountable to the people but to an elitist group of moneyed and sometimes foreign investors. It became apparent that profit, not public service, was the priority of the Bank of the U.S. Although this is all true of the National Bank, it, with its national currency, was a source of credit and stability, if not of the people individually, but of the nation as a whole, and it proved to be an important and useful part of the country's expanding economy. Overall, majority of the common people, mostly Jacksonian followers, were fed up with the bank.
How did the election of 1832 reflect modern politics? The election of 1832 was the first time the third party was introduced into the national election. The new party was introduced was the Anti-Masons Party, which was led by William Wirt. This party was directly against Andrew Jackson due to him being a member of the Masons. This, however, instead of hurting Jackson, actually helped him by taking away votes from Henry Clay. The eventual numbers for the election were 687,000 votes for Andrew Jackson, 530,000 votes for Henry Clay, and 101,000 votes for Wirt. If Clay were able to get the votes that went to Wirt, he might not have had the electoral upset he received, and instead would have been in a much closer election. When a third party affected the vote as much as it did was in 1992, which with the third party candidate was Ross Perot, who was a billionaire who ran off of the fears of the people. He was leading in the polls at one point but dropped out due to personal issues and later rejoined. He was able to get 20% of the popular vote, however not getting any electoral votes took away from George Bush Sr., which allowed Bill Clinton the easy victory. A major way this election reflects modern-day elections is how it is focused completely on one issue, which was the National Bank. Andrew Jackson's anger was fueled off of the fact Henry Clay pushed a bill through to renew the National Bank 4 years before it needed to be renewed. It made it a key factor of the election. Due to the fact Jackson had such a large following, even such a controversial issue as this was not able to stop him from being elected and instead put the bank in a worse spot than it would have been. This idea of pushing matters is something done all of the time in politics today. For instance, whether Congress is overly Democratic or Republican, bills will be pushed through before big events to aid in their party's efforts. This was the first time the National Convention was called to name the candidates. This was something that was completely new. It added to the emerging ideas that are present in today's politics. It was becoming more entertaining and more accessible to the common people. Before now, elections relied on political stratagem and at the polls and swinging congressmen one way or another. Now it also included baby kissing and appealing to common Americans. An example of this is the Democratic National Convention and Republican National Convention, which are broadcasted live on TV.